Greetings YouTube and welcome back to Grognard Games. I'm your host Martin Brown, and today we're going to be taking a real deep dive into history, and we're going to be looking at one thing specifically, and that is dice. And where on earth did they come from? Where have we got these wonderful little shaped random generators that roll across our tables in our games and create all kinds of interesting diversions for us to perhaps follow or fall victim to? Now, I'm not talking about the dice purely from a role-playing perspective here. So when I say we're going to deep dive into history, I really mean it. And we're going to start with the four-sided die, the tetrahedron, the caltrop, the die of doom. If you drop this on the floor and you step on it with bare feet, as I'm sure many of us have done, it usually ends up with only one response, and it usually starts with ow. So where does it come from? Well, and how old is it? It comes from Iraq, and it actually comes from a game called the Royal Game of Ur, sometimes known as the Game of 20 Squares. So how old is this game? Well, there's two boards that date back from the first dynasty of Ur, around 2600 BC. The game was actually played with no less than 3 tetrahedral dice. That's 3 four-sided dice being thrown across the table to play this game. Now, and that leads us on to the 6-sided die, the cube. Now, the oldest one of these goes all the way back to approximately 5,000 years that we've found so far. And it actually belongs in a 5,000-year-old backgammon set, which is found in a place called the Burnt City, which is an archaeological site in southeastern Iran. The next die is the D8. So, rather pointy. Again, not so good for your feet. An octahedron. The oldest one of these that we have on record is actually from a poker set from the year 1888. Now the next die is the 10-sided die. Now interestingly, I'm surprised this wasn't developed sooner. Perhaps it was and we simply haven't found it as of yet. But this was filed for patent in 1906 by a gentleman called Albert Friedenthal. So this leaves us with 2 more dice to cover. Now, they are the 12-sided dodecahedron, and they are the, now iconic I suppose, Icosahedron, the 20-sided die. Now, these dice come from 304 BC to 30 BC, somewhere in there, and here we call the Ptolemaic period from Egypt. So what do we derive from all of this? Aside from the fact that none of these dice are modern, unless you really want to count the 1906 patent for a D10, which we can't actually find or say for a fact did physically exist. So, how do historical artifacts come from being just that to being a mainstay of the role-playing hobby? And they've been there right from the beginning of the role-playing hobby. We really need to look at the wargaming scene, as it was in the 1960s, and one particular gentleman called David Wesley, who was running something called Braunstein, which was a period war game, and it was a game that required a referee. It actually required some role-playing, and it required some very, very sexy-looking archaic dice. And this really was the, I suppose to call it the proto role-playing game, maybe doing it a bit of a disservice. It probably was actually the kernel, the first embryonic role-playing game as we know it, as it became to be Dungeons and Dragons. And in this particular group was one gentleman called Dave Arneson, who attended a couple of these different sessions of Braunstein, and he started holding his own variant of this called Blackmore. And Blackmore was the longest running fantasy campaign for quite a considerable time, from when Dave Arneson made the inception of it all the way through to his recent death. Now, these dice are amazing probability deciders. Think about it. You roll a d4. What is a d4? Each side has a 25% chance of showing up. Cumulatively, if you say to me, you have a 75% chance of doing that, I only need to roll a d4 and get a 1 to 3, 75%, I've succeeded. On the 4, no, I've not succeeded. All of these dice really they're all percentile. Now I'm going to come back to the icosahedron, the D20. What is this really? What is it? It's probability split into 5% segments. And when you look at the D20 system, it's a percentile system that just happens to work in 5% increments. You want to roll 75%. No problem. Roll 15 or less on this die. That's it. When you start looking at your bonuses and your modifiers and you add +1, what are you actually adding in terms of percentage? Sit down and work it out. It's not that difficult. Really, this is a D100, except that it's removing some of the finer detail of the game. So instead of having to roll a 78, you would maybe roll a 75 or an 80. That's all you're really doing, and you're simply doing it on this. So each side has a 5% chance of appearing. It's cumulative. The bell curves have been removed from the game as time has gone by, but that's all these die are. They're probability, and that's more than likely, because I don't have the definitive answers, and looking around in the research, I don't think anybody does anymore. This is something that's kind of been lost as the eons have gone by. It's just probability, and these are really good indicators of probability. They're interesting methods of dividing probability down, and to be quite honest, they're pretty cool to play with. Anyway, thanks for your time. I'm Martin Brown. Thanks for watching Grognard Games. We'll see you soon.